The coronavirus epidemic was far too far along when there were still members of certain news outlets saying that it was all fake news, that it was all a Democrat hoax, that all of this was being done to discredit President Trump, and really that this was no worse than a case of the flu. If you lived in many parts of the United States, you might actually believe that because you had no evidence at all that coronavirus was a serious matter or that anyone you knew or cared about would ever suffer with it. But we in New York knew better. We heard the ambulances. We saw the physicians with that stricken look on their face as they left their shifts. We ourselves knew people who were sick, and many of us knew those who had died. There was no way to convince us that this was fake news or that this was a hoax. In a city like New York, where everything is very compact and where we live so closely together, we know among ourselves what's happening among ourselves. There really aren't any major secrets in a place like New York. I wonder if that's how Jerusalem was at the time of Jesus. The 122nd Psalm, the third verse, says in the prayer book, the version of the Psalms in the prayer book, Jerusalem is built as a city that is at unity with itself. Other translations of this psalm say that Jerusalem was a city that was strongly compact, that it was a city that was tightly knit. And I'm left with this image of it being a sort of place like Manhattan, where the boundaries are well defined and where the people live close together and where it is very hard to hide a major event. And so the disciples walk along talking about what was happening in their city, the tragedy that had fallen them, the disaster that was leading them to despair. And Jesus, when he stood among them, acted as if he had no idea what they were talking about. And as they said to him, you can't possibly live in Jerusalem and not know what's happening. It would be like somebody walking up to me on the street and saying, why exactly are you wearing that face mask? There really aren't any secrets. And so Jesus walked with them in their fear and disappointment and despair and took them eventually to that table where he broke the bread and where at once they saw that it was Jesus. That Jesus now becomes something different than he was before, almost unrecognizable, yet accessible to them in the breaking of the bread. This story of the disciples encountering Jesus on the road to Emmaus often is used to talk about the conviction of the church from its very earliest days, the experience of the church from its earliest days, that in the sharing of the Eucharistic meal and the breaking of the bread, Jesus makes himself present to his disciples, that Jesus is, as we say, really present, that there is real presence. In the breaking of the bread, we are having an encounter with Jesus. And that's how this story is often used as a way to talk about the Eucharistic encounter. If only in the midst of our own despair, our own confusion in our compact city, as we walk along these roads with our face masks and our fear, if only we could gather with the community at the Eucharistic table and come to know Jesus once again, as we do week by week, in the breaking of the bread, in that moment when minister approaches and into our hands puts that broken bread, and we know indeed that Jesus has made himself present among us. But unlike the disciples on the road to Emmaus, we will not meet Jesus at the Eucharistic table this week, and perhaps not for many, many more weeks to come. But there's something else about this story that's worth noticing. And that is Jesus was with them on that road, even if they didn't know it. Jesus was there with them as their companion in the midst of their despair, in the midst of their fear, in the midst of their disappointment. Jesus was with them. And when they recognized him in the breaking of the bread, they also had their eyes open to the fact that he had been with them all along. Whether they recognized him or not, he had been with them all along. And if there's anything that this terrible time offers to us, it seems to me is an opportunity to look again at how Jesus is with us on the road. That Jesus is with us on a road, even a road that is littered with fear and despair and a sense perhaps that life will never be normal again, that our hopes and all the things we trusted may have been dashed only to come back in a way that we cannot imagine. We in our city, we in our compact city, are still walking with Jesus on the Emmaus Road. And he is still walking with us. And when weeks from now, maybe even months from now, we at last are able to gather again at the table of the Lord's body and blood, it will be to experience in a way with energy and fervor, not something that we haven't had all along, something indeed that the disciples tell us we do have all along, that the Lord that we know in the breaking of the bread is present with us already on the Emmaus Road, the road of despair and fear that nonetheless can be a road of discovery and hope. Amen.